A racist cop assaults a black man and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, he discovers that he has arrested an FBI agent. The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow over the streets as Thomas Hayes drove home from a long day at the FBI field office. He was calm, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he navigated the quiet suburban roads. He was in no rush, his car cruising at exactly the speed limit, stopping at every light and signalling at every turn. To anyone watching, it was the picture of careful driving, deliberate, smooth, by the book. But none of that mattered as the sharp blare of a police siren cut through the stillness. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the flashing lights of a police cruiser tailing him. A wave of confusion washed over him. He hadn't done anything wrong, not even close. He pulled over to the side of the road, his mind already running through the protocol. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, comply. He rolled down the window and waited. Moments later, the officer approached, and Thomas couldn't help but notice the shift in the cop's demeanour as soon as he caught sight of him. "What's the problem, officer?" Thomas asked evenly, his voice controlled. The cop's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on his belt as if ready for trouble. "License and registration," he barked. No courtesy, no explanation. His tone dripped with suspicion. Thomas complied immediately, reaching slowly for his wallet and documents. As he handed them over, the officer's eyes flashed with something that wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was something darker, more dangerous. "So, you're just going to sit here and act like you don't know what you did?" the cop snapped. "I was just driving home, officer," Thomas replied, calm as ever. "I'm not sure what the issue is." "Sure you don't," the officer sneered, leaning in closer, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can just drive around here like you own the place, huh?" Thomas could see where this was going. He'd seen it before, but that didn't stop the familiar knot from tightening in his stomach. He remained polite. "I was following the speed limit, officer. If there's something wrong, I'd be happy to know what it is." But his calmness only seemed to agitate the cop more. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Think you can outsmart me?" Without warning, the officer yanked the car door open, his hand gripping Thomas's arm roughly. "Step out of the vehicle." The sudden aggression startled Thomas, but he kept his composure. "Officer, there's no need for—" "I said, step out of the car." The cop's voice was now a roar, his grip tightening painfully. Thomas raised his hands in surrender and stepped out of the vehicle, moving carefully, knowing that any wrong move could make things worse. But it wasn't enough. The cop shoved him hard against the side of the car, wrenching his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest." "For what?" Thomas asked, his voice still steady, though the frustration was beginning to rise. "Shut up!" The cop slammed him down on the hood of the car. "I said, you're under arrest." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Here he was, a federal agent, treated like a criminal for no reason other than the colour of his skin. He wanted to tell the cop who he was, to pull out his FBI badge, but something told him that wouldn't change a thing. Not now. The situation had already spiralled out of control. Thomas Hayes stood by the side of the road, his hands cuffed behind his back, watching as the officer rummaged through his car. Every move the cop made seemed laced with purpose, each drawer pulled open with a kind of desperate anticipation. The officer's brow furrowed as he dug deeper, slamming compartments shut, his frustration mounting. It was clear that he wasn't finding whatever it was he had hoped to. Thomas remained quiet, standing tall despite the discomfort of the metal cuffs biting into his wrists. The weight of the situation was heavy, but he stayed composed. Years of training had prepared him for high-pressure moments, but this was something else. This wasn't about law enforcement or justice. It was about something far more sinister, the colour of his skin. "Nothing to say now, huh?" the cop grumbled as he slammed the glove box closed. He stepped back, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. His eyes scanned the car once more, like a predator searching for an opening. Thomas didn't respond, knowing that anything he said would only fuel the fire. But his silence seemed to unnerve the officer. Suddenly, the cop's hand reached into his pocket. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he watched the officer pull out a small, crumpled bottle of pills. He moved with casual ease as if it were just part of the routine search. But there was nothing routine about it. The officer opened the door again and bent down, slipping the bottle under the passenger seat with a swift, practiced motion. Thomas's heart rate picked up. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. But he didn't react. Not outwardly. The cop straightened up, stepping back from the vehicle with a smirk playing on his lips. Well, what do we have here? He reached under the seat and pulled out the bottle as if it had been there all along. That's not mine, Thomas said, his voice steady but firm, finally breaking his silence. His eyes locked onto the officer's. Oh, really? The cop chuckled darkly, shaking the bottle for emphasis. And I suppose someone else just left these here, right? You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances. Thomas clenched his jaw, but held his composure. Officer, I don't know where that came from, but I can assure you it's not mine. Yeah, sure it's not. The officer walked toward him, holding the bottle up as if it was some grand piece of evidence. You must think you're real slick, don't you? But it doesn't matter how smooth you talk or how calm you act. You're caught. For a split second, Thomas thought about revealing the truth, about mentioning the dash cam that had captured everything, the illegal stop, the aggression, and now the planted evidence. But he held back. He wasn't ready to show his cards yet. Instead, he remained still, his gaze unwavering. This is a mistake, officer. The cop's face twisted with anger at Thomas's unshaken calm. No, the only mistake was thinking you could get away with this. As the cop moved to shove him back toward the police cars, Thomas felt the weight of the situation settle over him. He could tell that the officer wasn't just trying to arrest him, he was trying to bury him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The squad car rattled down the road, a constant hum filling the confined space. Officer Franklin sat in the front, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel, jaw clenched, stealing occasional glances at the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Thomas Hayes sat cuffed, his back straight, eyes focused on the road ahead. His demeanor remained steady, calm, unshaken, despite the officer's palpable hostility. You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Franklin sneered, glancing at Thomas through the mirror. Think you can just pull that good citizen act and walk away from this? Thomas didn't flinch, his gaze still fixed outside the window, the blur of streetlights illuminating his composed face. His silence was deliberate, measured. He knew Franklin was trying to bait him, to get a rise out of him. But Thomas had dealt with men like him before. He knew the type, and he wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. When the officer didn't get an answer, his anger bubbled closer to the surface. Typical. You people are all the same, always thinking you're above the law. He smirked, as if he'd said something clever, waiting for Thomas to react. But Thomas just leaned back slightly, meeting the officer's eyes through the mirror with a calm intensity that made Franklin falter for a split second. You're awfully talkative for a man who doesn't know the first thing about me, Thomas said, his voice cool and even. It wasn't an argument, just a statement. Franklin's smirk vanished, replaced with a scowl. I know enough. Don't have to know your whole life story to see what's in front of me. Thomas raised an eyebrow, but his expression didn't change. And what exactly do you see? Franklin slammed his hand against the dashboard. I see a punk who thinks he's untouchable just because he's got that suit and fancy car. Let me tell you something. You're not special. Not out here. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. But it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of a man who had heard all of this before. If that's what you see, officer, then maybe the problem isn't me. Franklin whipped his head around, glaring at Thomas as if he couldn't believe the nerve. Keep running that mouth, smartass. See where it gets you. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Franklin's. I've been doing this a long time, he said calmly. I've seen men like you before. You're scared of what I represent. But let me give you a piece of advice. Fear makes you sloppy. Franklin's face reddened with anger, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Watch your tone, boy, or you'll regret it. Thomas didn't blink. I'm not the one with something to regret. The air inside the car was thick with tension now, Franklin breathing hard as he tried to contain his fury, while Thomas remained cool, unaffected by the officer's hostility. Franklin's silence stretched on for miles, broken only by the occasional muttered curse. As they neared the station, Franklin's anger simmered, barely contained. You think this ends when we get there? Franklin growled. You don't even know what's coming. Thomas sat back, his voice calm as ever. I know exactly what's coming. And with that, Franklin's threats dissolved into the whine of the squad car's tyres pulling into the station lot. The ride had been long, but Thomas knew it was far from over. Still, his confidence remained unshaken. He wasn't just any man. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But soon they would. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the rows of desks, casting a dull, pale glow on the well-worn tiles. Officer Franklin stood rigidly behind the processing counter, trying to hide the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He had just handed over his arrest report and was waiting, his hands nervously tapping at his sides as the desk officer glanced over it. But something was off. The moment the desk officer, a wiry, seasoned man who had seen too much, looked at the suspect's name, his face changed. There was a flicker of recognition, a brief tightening of his jaw as he glanced up from the paperwork and met Thomas's calm gaze. A long pause followed, thick with unspoken tension. You arrested this guy? The desk officer asked, his voice quiet, eyes narrowing at Franklin. Yeah, I did, Franklin replied quickly, trying to mask his discomfort with a cocky tone. Found pills in his car, illegal stuff. He resisted. Thomas, still calm and composed, despite everything, said nothing. He had been through the roughness of the arrest, the baseless accusations, and the humiliation. But this was the moment where things would start shifting. The desk officer stood up, his fingers brushing over the form, eyes fixed on Franklin now, no longer masked by professionalism. Sit tight, he said, his voice tight. I'll be right back. As he disappeared behind a door marked Captain's Office, Franklin shifted uneasily. He could feel eyes on him now. Some of the other officers glanced in his direction, their expressions hard to read. Whispers began to rise as they exchanged glances, sensing that something wasn't right. Inside the office, Captain Miller sat hunched over his desk, his sharp eyes scanning a stack of reports when the desk officer entered, holding the paperwork like it carried a secret. Sir, he said, we've got a situation. The captain looked up, his face hardened by years of experience, yet always perceptive. What is it? The desk officer handed over the report. The guy Franklin brought in, the arrest doesn't add up. And this man, Thomas, he's FBI. Captain Miller didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. He picked up the report, reading through it in silence. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the details. Erratic driving, resisting arrest, and the pills Franklin had conveniently found in the car. Miller's jaw tightened. He had been in the force long enough to smell when something wasn't right, and this reeked of trouble. He knew Franklin's type, the kind who thought the badge was a license for unchecked power, but this was different. This was bigger. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I want to talk to Franklin. Now. The desk officer nodded and headed back out, motioning for Franklin to follow. The officer's swagger was gone now, replaced by a thin veil of nervousness. He walked into the captain's office, where the air was suddenly much colder, much heavier. Miller didn't offer him a seat. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his eyes boring into Franklin's. You've been with us a while, Franklin, Miller began, his voice calm but edged with steel. So I'm going to ask you straight, why did you arrest this man? Franklin swallowed hard. I told you, sir. He was driving erratically. You found drugs, Miller interrupted, his voice suddenly sharper. Convenient, isn't it? Franklin's mouth twitched. "I'm just doing my job." Miller said nothing for a moment, letting the silence build. The room felt small, too tight, and Franklin's confidence was quickly unraveling under the weight of the captain's scrutiny. "I spoke with the desk officer," Miller said slowly, each word deliberate. "Turns out this man you arrested isn't just some random black guy driving around. He's an FBI agent, and something about your report doesn't sit right." Franklin's face went pale, his mind racing. "I didn't know, or didn't care." Miller's eyes flashed, his voice low but full of menace. "Because if you knew who you were pulling over, you'd know this isn't going to end the way you think." Franklin shifted uncomfortably, but the captain's words had struck a nerve. Franklin had walked into this thinking it was another routine stop. But now, with the weight of the situation bearing down on him, the enormity of his mistake became clear. Miller's gaze stayed fixed on him. "I want the full story, Franklin, and don't leave anything out." Franklin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew now that he had crossed a line that even his badge wouldn't protect him from this time. The precinct, usually bustling with the day-to-day routine of paperwork, arrests, and coffee runs, had taken on a different kind of energy. Whispers lingered at the edges of every conversation, and the tension between officers was palpable. Captain Miller had called for a formal investigation. Thomas, still calm and resolute, sat quietly in the holding area. Though he was behind bars, his composure made it seem like he was the one in control, while the rest of the station spiraled into chaos around him. Captain Miller's footsteps echoed through the corridor as he moved with purpose, his mind already working through the next steps. He needed to handle this delicately. On the surface, it was a routine arrest gone wrong, but the deeper he dug, the more it reeked of something much uglier. Back in his office, he motioned for the desk officer to bring in Franklin's report again, along with any body cam footage from the arrest. Miller knew that the dash cam from Thomas's car held the real truth, but for now, he'd start with what was on hand. His fingers tapped the edge of the file as he opened the report, eyes scanning the familiar lines Franklin had hastily written. Nothing jumped out immediately, but that was the point. Franklin wasn't dumb. He knew how to write an arrest report that seemed clean. Miller sighed, his mind already starting to piece together the timeline, but he needed the footage to confirm his suspicions. Outside the office, Officer Franklin wasn't sitting idle. His mind raced, knowing the walls were starting to close in. He knew Miller had doubts, knew that the dashcam footage would show things differently than his carefully constructed version of events. But Franklin had been on the force for years, long enough to have built relationships. He leaned against the wall near the break room, eyes scanning for officers he could trust. He spotted two he knew would have his back, Officer Taylor and Officer Rodriguez, men who had shared countless shifts and after-hours beers with him. "You good?" Taylor asked, noting Franklin's restless energy. "Yeah," Franklin replied, trying to play it cool. "Just need a favor." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. Loyalty ran deep within their group. Franklin leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Miller's looking to dig up something on me. You know how he gets." Taylor exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, both understanding the unsaid message. They had known Franklin long enough to know what he was asking. "What do you need?" "Just be careful what you say. You know, if anyone asks about the arrest." Franklin's voice tightened as he tried to remain calm. "It's all clean, but Miller's been acting like he's got something to prove." Rodriguez frowned but nodded slightly, understanding the game. They'd look out for him, but even they could sense that this situation was teetering on the edge of something bigger. There was more tension in Franklin's request than usual, and it left a sour taste in their mouths. As the day wore on, the internal divisions started to become clearer. In the locker room, Franklin tried to quietly sway others, planting doubts about the FBI agent's behavior and subtly framing himself as a victim of an overzealous captain. A few listened, nodding in agreement, but others were more cautious. The story wasn't adding up, and the whispers of racism that floated through the station began to surface. Meanwhile, Miller had begun his investigation in earnest. He sat in front of his computer, pulling up the body cam footage. The first few seconds played out as he expected. Routine questioning, escalating tension. But when he watched the part where Franklin dragged Thomas from the car and threw him to the ground, Miller's jaw tightened. It wasn't justified, not by a long shot. He took a deep breath and hit pause, fingers rubbing at his temple. He knew Franklin was trying to cover his tracks. Miller had seen enough to recognize when someone was hiding behind procedure. But now the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about departmental loyalty or covering up for one of their own. This was a serious allegation with racial undertones that could explode beyond the walls of the station. Miller's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. "Yeah?" It was the tech team. "We've pulled the dashcam footage from the FBI agent's car. Should be ready in an hour." Miller nodded, his voice steady. "Good. Send it to me the moment it's ready." As he hung up, he leaned back in his chair. The weight of what was about to unravel sat heavy in his chest. He wasn't just dealing with an arrest gone wrong. This could blow wide open, and he needed to be ready for the fallout. Back in the holding area, Thomas remained quiet, sitting calmly in the cell, hands folded in his lap. His mind was sharp, always working, but he kept his cards close. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere around him. The other officers weren't looking at him with casual disregard anymore. There was something else in their eyes now, a growing realization that this wasn't going to end the way Franklin had planned. The tension in the station grew thicker with every passing hour, lines being drawn silently between those loyal to Franklin and those who trusted the captain. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Something big was about to break. The phone rang in Captain Miller's office, the harsh tone cutting through the thick silence. He answered with a terse, "Miller here." But even before the voice on the other end spoke, he could feel the pressure mounting. "Captain, this is Chief Director Evans from City Hall," a voice said, cold and businesslike. "We've been hearing some troubling news about an arrest involving an FBI agent. It's gaining attention, and frankly, we need to manage this situation carefully. You know what I mean." Miller leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation already pressing down on him. He knew where this was going. The higher-ups didn't care about justice or the truth. They cared about the optics. "I'm aware of the situation, Director," Miller replied, keeping his tone neutral, but there was a tightness in his voice. "I'm handling it." "Good. But listen," Evans' voice dropped a little, as if sharing a secret. "We don't need this blowing up into a racial incident, especially with the media sniffing around. Handle it quietly, discreetly. The last thing we need is a headline that says a black FBI agent was assaulted by one of our own officers. You understand the implications, right?" Miller clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing at the vague threat hanging in the air. "I understand," he said, but the knot in his stomach tightened. He wasn't sure he could, or would, handle this quietly. As the call ended, Miller slammed the phone down a little harder than he intended. His mind raced. This was no longer just about Franklin's misconduct or a wrongful arrest. It was about politics, racial tension, and the higher-ups trying to sweep it all under the rug. In the holding cell, Thomas sat quietly, but even he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air. He wasn't blind to the way the other officers now avoided making eye contact with him. The whispers, the sudden phone calls, the sense that something bigger was happening behind the scenes, all pointed to one undeniable fact. This situation was spiraling far beyond the precinct walls. Then came another twist. Thomas, still resolutely calm, received word that his superiors at the FBI had launched an internal review. They wanted answers too. Fast. It wasn't just the local police under scrutiny now. It was the entire situation. The racial implications were glaring, and the FBI didn't want to be caught in the middle of a scandal that could tarnish their name. Thomas couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. He had served the Bureau with integrity and pride, and now, because of one man's racial hatred, his entire career could be put under a microscope. The the fact that his innocence should have been obvious made the sting even worse. He wasn't a criminal, but here he was, treated like one, scrutinized like one, because of the color of his skin. Even in his position of power, with a badge of authority, he was not immune to the poison of racial bias. He took a deep breath, his face a mask of calm, even as his heart raced. He knew how these things could play out. He could be the scapegoat in this political game, or worse, his entire career could end, not because of anything he had done, but because of the colour of his skin. Back at the precinct, Captain Miller was walking a tightrope. Pressure from the city and the state to handle things quietly was growing louder. Miller was a good man, a man of principle, but even he could feel the weight of his superiors trying to nudge him towards sweeping the entire situation under the rug. The officers in the station had also begun to split. There were murmurs of, "Why is this becoming such a big deal?" from a few of Franklin's loyalists. Others, those who had quietly witnessed too much over the years, were beginning to question Franklin's story and themselves. Had they been complicit in similar situations before? Had they turned a blind eye when it didn't affect them? Tension between officers bubbled just below the surface. One group, reluctant to let go of their friend and colleague Franklin, believed the arrest was being overblown. Another group, those who sided with the captain, had begun to see the cracks in the facade. It was becoming clear that this was not just a single incident, but part of a much larger systemic problem. Miller's office door opened, and the precinct's legal advisor, Michelle Davis, walked in, her expression grim. "We need to tread carefully here, Captain," she said, her voice low. "The Bureau is involved now, and this is turning into a minefield. We can't afford to make a mistake." "I'm aware," Miller replied, his fingers tapping restlessly on his desk. "But I won't let this go quietly. Not when it's obvious Franklin crossed a line." Michelle sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "I agree, but you need to be prepared for the fallout. If this escalates, the department could take a serious hit, and there will be people, powerful people, who won't want this out in the open." Miller rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. "We'll do what's right, Michelle, no matter the cost." Thomas, still detained, watched the precinct's activity around him with keen eyes. He knew the game they were playing, the attempts to quietly brush it all aside, the efforts to shield Franklin from the consequences of his actions. But he also knew that Captain Miller wasn't like the others. He saw the look in the captain's eyes, the determination to see this through. It gave him some comfort, but the stakes were higher now than ever. As the hours ticked by, Thomas couldn't shake the bitter reality. The system, which was supposed to serve justice, was bending to the weight of racial prejudice once again. Even with all the evidence in his favour, his race was being used against him, turning an open and shut case into a political and racial minefield. The holding cell was cold, the walls heavy with the weight of time and silence. Thomas sat on the hard bench, his back straight and his gaze forward. But inside, he felt the sharp sting of injustice gnawing at him. The quiet hum of the precinct echoed in his ears, but it was the kind of quiet that carried menace, a quiet that buzzed with unspoken threats, lingering in the air like static electricity. He'd been in custody for hours now, though it felt like days. Despite the captain's investigation and the gathering evidence in his favour, Thomas knew the storm was far from over. His skin, his presence, still marked him as different. Even here, inside the very system he had dedicated his life to uphold, the barriers between him and fairness felt insurmountable. The door to the cell block creaked open, and Officer Franklin strolled in, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Two of his buddies followed, faces drawn tight with smug grins. They weren't here for a casual check-in. Thomas didn't move, but he felt the weight of their stares as they closed in. Franklin stood in front of the cell, his eyes burning with something dark and malicious. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Franklin sneered, gripping the bars tightly, his knuckles turning white. "You really thought you could walk around here, big shot FBI, and get away with whatever you wanted?" Thomas remained silent, his calm demeanour unbroken, though inside he could feel the tension coiling tighter. He knew this type of officer, one who thrived on dominance, who wielded his badge like a weapon instead of a shield. Franklin's face twisted into a smirk, his voice lowering to a taunting whisper. "You must think you're something special. But let me tell you something, boy. Out there." He jerked his chin towards the world beyond the walls of the station. "Nobody cares about your shiny badge or your fancy title. To them, you're just another criminal, just another thug in a suit." The word boy hit Thomas like a slap to the face. It wasn't new. He'd heard it before, all his life. But coming from Franklin, here, in this place where justice was supposed to reign, it was a reminder of how deep the hate ran. Franklin took a step back, his arms folding over his chest as his friends flanked him. The tension in the air thickened. "You've got a choice, you know," one of the other officers, a lanky man with a slick grin, chimed in. "You can drop this little complaint of yours, walk out of here and forget it ever happened. Or—" his voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken threat to hang, cold and heavy. Thomas stared at them, his face unreadable. But his mind churned. The calm facade he wore was ironclad, but beneath it, anger simmered. The idea of surrendering, of letting these men get away with this, because they thought they could intimidate him, because they believed his skin colour made him less deserving of justice, was unthinkable. Franklin chuckled darkly, stepping closer again, pressing his face near the bars. "You really want to play this game? Think the captain's going to save you? Think that dash cam footage is enough?" His voice was laced with venom. "You'll lose everything, boy. You know how the world works for people like you. Even if you win, you lose." Thomas inhaled slowly, his pulse steady, despite the growing heat of rage inside him. He had faced prejudice his entire life, but it never ceased to amaze him how brazen it could be, even here, even when he had followed every rule, done everything right. "I'm not afraid of you," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. His eyes met Franklin's with an unflinching resolve. The room fell silent, the other officers shifting uneasily. Franklin's smirk faltered, just for a second, but enough for Thomas to see it. The FBI agent had faced far worse men than Franklin. He knew the game, and he knew how to survive it. Franklin's face tightened. He stepped back, his bravado suddenly lacking its earlier force. "You should be," he hissed, but the bite was gone from his words. "You really should be." The officers turned to leave, but as Franklin reached the door, he threw one last look over his shoulder. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The door slammed shut, and Thomas was left alone again. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes briefly, letting the tension ebb away. But the anger remained, deep in his chest. The message was clear. Even here, even with the truth on his side, they would stop at nothing to break him. They couldn't accept a black man in power, especially one who refused to bend to their intimidation. But he wouldn't break. Not here. Not now. Later, when the captain came to check on him, Thomas recounted the exchange in measured words. Captain Miller's face hardened, the lines around his mouth tightening with each word. The more he listened, the more his suspicions of Franklin were confirmed. This wasn't just a bad arrest. It was a malicious, racially fueled attack, and Franklin was spiraling, desperate to cover his tracks. "I'm getting you out of here," Miller said, his voice low but firm. "We've got enough to make this right, but it's going to take time." Thomas nodded, grateful but wary. "I know, but time's running out." Thomas stood tall as the cell door clanged open, the cold metal sound echoing in the small room. He'd been sitting for hours, not broken, but seething with a quiet, controlled rage that simmered beneath his calm exterior. As the officer led him out, the look in his eyes was one of defiance, not fear. He was released, yes, but this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The precinct was eerily quiet as Thomas walked through the halls. A few officers glanced his way, most unsure of what to say, others too ashamed to meet his gaze. But Thomas didn't care about them. His eyes were locked on one person, Officer Franklin, who stood by the desk, arms crossed, the smugness he had earlier replaced with unease. Thomas stopped directly in front of Franklin, his dark eyes narrowing, the room crackling with tension. Franklin avoided his stare, but Thomas leaned in, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the silence. "I'm coming for you," Thomas said, each word precise, deliberate. "You think you can get away with this. You think your lies and your hate will keep you safe. You're wrong. I'm coming for you, and when I do, no badge will save you." For a second, Franklin's face twitched, his facade cracking under the weight of Thomas's words. The other officers stood frozen, the weight of what just happened settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Thomas straightened up, turned his back on Franklin, and walked out of the precinct with his head held high. This wasn't over. He knew it. Franklin knew it, and soon the whole world would know it too. Captain Miller sat in his office, the tape in his hands, its weight far heavier than the small plastic casing would suggest. The dashcam footage had arrived, silent, unassuming, but carrying the power to unravel everything. He knew what it contained, had watched it already, and its contents left no doubt. It showed the truth, unfiltered and clear. Officer Franklin's malicious intent, his lies, and the racial hatred that fueled this arrest. Miller leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of his decision. He had two options: bury this footage, shield his department from the storm that would surely follow, or hand it over to the FBI, setting in motion a public reckoning that would tear the fabric of the precinct apart. But as an officer of the law, there really was only one choice. His fingers tightened around the tape. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, a captain who upheld justice without bending to political pressure or corruption. But this decision carried a different weight. It meant breaking the thin blue line, potentially alienating officers he'd worked with for years. It meant exposing a cancer within his ranks. He looked out of the window, the city skyline blurred by the morning fog, and made up his mind. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the trial began. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit pressed and immaculate, but beneath the crisp exterior, he was on edge. His hands rested on the table, steady, but his mind raced. This trial wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about much more, about the truth, about standing up to a system that had failed him, not just in this moment, but throughout his life. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and tension. The gallery was full, journalists scribbling notes, reporters whispering to each other as they prepared to broadcast the case. Thomas could feel their eyes on him, like a spotlight that burned into his skin. He was used to pressure, it came with the job, but this felt different. It felt personal. At the defense table, Officer Franklin sat with his lawyer, a seasoned professional who had built a career on navigating tricky legal waters. He was smooth, polished in his arguments, the kind of lawyer who knew how to manipulate a jury's emotions without them realizing it. Thomas watched Franklin out of the corner of his eye. The officer had the air of someone who still believed in his own invincibility, his arrogance seeping into every sneer, every sideways glance. As the defense made their case, they attacked Thomas's credibility subtly but persistently. Franklin's lawyer painted him as overly sensitive, implying that he had overreacted, misinterpreting what had been a routine traffic stop. He framed the arrest as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a series of mistakes that could happen to anyone. The words twisted like a knife in Thomas's gut, but he remained composed. The trial dragged on, each day feeling like a battle of wills. Witnesses were called, cross-examinations delivered with the sharpness of a blade. The defense fought tooth and nail, exploiting every legal technicality they could find. But Thomas's hope was anchored in one thing: the dashcam footage. It was the captain's turn to testify. As Captain Miller took the stand, Thomas could feel the shift in the room. The air seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miller's expression was calm but resolute, a man who had made his decision and would stand by it, no matter the cost. Franklin's lawyer approached the captain with a measured confidence, his voice oozing calm professionalism. He tried to discredit the footage before it was even introduced, questioning Miller's leadership, suggesting that perhaps the captain was motivated by a desire to avoid public scandal. He hinted at personal biases, implying that Miller might have something to gain by throwing one of his own officers under the bus. But Captain Miller remained unflappable. His responses were firm, clear, and without hesitation. He had seen the truth, and he would not let it be buried. Finally, the moment came. Miller, the man who could have buried this entire case, who could have protected his precinct's image, presented the dashcam footage to the court. The judge ordered the footage to be played. The courtroom fell silent as the screen flickered to life. The video began, the shaky footage showing the moment Thomas's car was pulled over. The courtroom watched as the officer's behavior quickly escalated from routine to aggression. Franklin's voice, laced with thinly veiled contempt, filled the room. They saw the unjust arrest unfold, the planted evidence, the bottle of pills Franklin had so confidently tossed into Thomas's car. There was no disputing it now. The evidence was irrefutable. The silence that followed the footage was deafening. Franklin's face had gone pale, his arrogance crumbling as the reality of what he had done settled in. His lawyer fumbled for words, but there was nothing left to say. The room buzzed with tension as the jurors exchanged glances, their expressions grim. Across the aisle, Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Relief, anger, vindication all at once. He had held on, despite everything. He had faced the threats, the intimidation, the lies. And now, the truth was laid bare for all to see. The trial ended swiftly after that. The dashcam footage had sealed Franklin's fate. The jury returned their verdict. Franklin was guilty, not only of misconduct, but of a hate-fueled abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Thomas didn't hear them. His heart was pounding in his chest, his emotions a mix of triumph and exhaustion. As he stood to leave, Captain Miller approached him, his face grave but respectful. "You did the right thing," Thomas said quietly. Miller nodded, but his eyes carried the weight of the choice he had made. "So did you." Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the city. But despite the victory, Thomas knew the fight wasn't over. He had won this battle, but the scars left behind, the racial hatred, the systemic corruption, would take longer to heal. As he walked down the courthouse steps, his mind was already focused on the future. He knew what he had to do: continue the fight, continue holding the system accountable, and most importantly, continue to protect and serve, no matter the cost. He had made a vow long ago, and today only strengthened it, to save lives, even in a world that often failed to save him.